Peter Sellers died 8 times in a single night. Not in a film, not on a stage, not in the way we speak loosely about experiences that feel like dying, medically, clinically. 8 separate times, the electrical current that kept his heart beating went silent, and the doctors in that hospital room brought him back. 8 times, one night, one room at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, April 1964. And for 12 years, nobody knew what he had seen in the space between. But on a Thursday night in October of 1976, Peter Sellers walked onto the stage of The Tonight Show, sat down across from Johnny Carson, and in the middle of an interview that had started with easy laughter about Inspector Clouseau and ended with the entire studio unable to make a sound, he told the truth. All of it. For the first and last time. What he described in that chair changed the way Johnny Carson thought about death. It changed the way the producers who heard it thought about the man they had always assumed was simply an actor. And it left one camera operator, a veteran of 11 years at NBC, shaking so badly that he had to hand off his position to a colleague before the segment ended. He stood in the corridor outside the studio, back against the wall, unable to explain what had undone him. He just kept saying it was the name, that it was the name that did it. But to understand what Peter Sellers said that night, you have to understand something first. You have to understand that Peter Sellers, the most gifted character actor of his generation, the man who had made the world laugh harder than almost anyone alive, did not believe he existed. But before we go any further, I see messages all the time in the comment section that some of you didn't realize you didn't subscribe. So if you could do me a favor and double check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's simple. It's a free thing that anybody that watches this show frequently can do to help us keep everything going in the trajectory it's on. So please do double check if you've subscribed, and thank you so much, because in a strange way you're part of our history and you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. Not in any ordinary sense of despair or constructed modesty, literally. The man known to the world as Peter Sellers believed, with complete and private sincerity, that there was no real person standing behind the characters. That whatever Richard Henry Sellers had once been, the name he was born with, the identity he had been handed at birth, had been vacated so thoroughly and so long ago that nothing remained. When people asked who he really was when the cameras were off, he did not deflect. He told them the truth as he understood it. There is no me. There is only the parts I play. The world laughed when he said it. They assumed it was a bit or theatrical eccentricity, or the kind of mystery a brilliant performer cultivated to protect his mystique. But the people who had spent actual time with him away from sets and press appearances understood that he meant it literally. He was telling them something factual about his interior experience, and they were reading it as performance, which was, when you understood the full weight of it, the most characteristic thing that could possibly happen to Peter Sellers. What you are about to hear is the story of the night that changed, the night he looked across Johnny Carson's desk and said something he had never said to anyone in 12 years of carrying it alone. Something that had nothing to do with the characters and everything to do with the one moment in his life when there were no characters left to retreat into. Because when Peter Sellers died 8 times in April of 1964, Inspector Clouseau could not follow him in there. Dr. Strangelove could not help him. Not one of the 100 brilliant, intricate people he had spent his career becoming could go with him into that room. There was only Richard Henry Sellers, alone in the dark between one heartbeat and the next, facing something that no performance in the history of cinema had prepared a man to face. His real name was Richard Henry Sellers. Almost no one had ever called him that. He was born on September 8, 1925, in Southsea, Portsmouth, England, to Agnes Doreen Marks, who went by Peg, and William Sellers, a music hall entertainer. It was Peg who mattered. It was always Peg. She named her son after a brother who had died in infancy, a boy named Richard, who had never made it to his first birthday. Peter came into the world already carrying the name of someone who had left it, the ghost of a boy no one had gotten to know. Peg loved her son with the ferocity of a woman who had already lost a child and was not prepared to lose another. Total, engulfing, all-consuming love. She wrapped it around him so completely that there was barely room inside it for him to develop edges of his own. He was hers. He was the continuation of something she was already doing, not quite a separate person. And what that love produced, without intending to, was a boy who grew up learning to become whatever the moment required, because becoming things was easier than knowing what he actually was. He discovered he could do voices at around 4 years old, not imitate people, inhabit them. He could locate the interior logic of a person and live inside it so completely that from the outside you could not tell where the imitation ended and reality began. His father's music hall friends would gather on Saturday evenings, and young Richard, already going by Peter, would move through the room changing voices, changing postures, becoming and unbecoming, one person after another, to the delight of everyone watching. Nobody asked what he was doing the rest of the week. During the hours when there was no audience and no performance required. During the quiet moments when ordinary children were simply being themselves, because the answer was that he was not being himself. He did not know how. The self that should have been accumulating in the spaces between performances had never properly formed. There was the performed version of Peter Sellers, which would grow from those Saturday evenings in Portsmouth into BBC radio stardom and then international cinema. And there was the space underneath it. Not a self exactly. A room where a self should have been, kept carefully empty. He was, by the early 1960s, one of the most sought-after actors working in the English language. Dr. Strangelove, The Pink Panther, Lolita. Stanley Kubrick, who was not a man given to casual praise of anything, said publicly that Sellers was the most gifted actor he had ever worked with. What Sellers could do on screen was qualitatively different from other actors. He did not perform characters. He became them completely, without remainder, and when the director called cut, the character departed and nothing came back to take its place. He married 4 times. Each time, the woman fell in love with one of the versions before discovering there was no one inside them waiting to be met. His first wife, Anne Howe, said years later that she had spent the early part of their marriage searching for the real Peter, and had eventually concluded that Peter simply did not understand what she was looking for. He was giving her everything he had. The tragedy was that everything he had did not include the thing she needed. He was 38 years old in the spring of 1964. At the height of his career, filming in Los Angeles on the Billy Wilder production Kiss Me Stupid, which had been troubled from the start. The set was tense. The collaboration between Wilder and Sellers was not working, and Sellers had been having chest discomfort for several days, a tightness he attributed to stress in the Los Angeles air and the 3 cups of coffee he drank each morning to sustain the pace of the schedule. He was not a man who went to doctors unless a situation was unambiguous. His body was the instrument through which the characters lived, and instruments were not supposed to develop opinions of their own. But wait, do not miss this detail. Because what happened in the early hours of April 6, 1964, was not a medical event that interrupted Peter Sellers' life. It was the event that divided his life into everything before and everything after. And the reason it divided him so completely had nothing to do with the physical facts of what his heart did that night. It had to do with what he saw. On the evening of April 5th, Sellers had a quiet dinner alone in his bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel. He went to bed early. The tightness in his chest had been worse that afternoon, but had eased by evening, and he filed it in the same category as always: stress. The air, the coffee. He woke at approximately 2 in the morning, with pain that was different from anything before, not the vague tightness, something structural, something that felt, as he would describe it 12 years later on a stage in Burbank, like the walls of a room deciding they were no longer interested in being walls. He reached for the telephone. His hand was not cooperating the way hands usually cooperate. He got through to the front desk. He said enough. He lay back and watched the ceiling while he waited, and the ceiling did not stay entirely still. The paramedics arrived within 7 minutes. By the time they reached Cedars-Sinai, the first cardiac arrest had already occurred in transit. His heart stopped for the first time at approximately 3:17 in the morning. The cardiac team brought him back. It stopped again at 3:31. They brought him back. It stopped a third time before 4 in the morning. They brought him back. What is almost impossible to communicate in ordinary language is what 8 cardiac arrests in a single night actually looks like from inside the room. It does not look like a single dramatic crisis and a heroic recovery. It looks like intervals. A man returning to consciousness, terrified, disoriented, being stabilized, the monitors settling, the team exhaling, and then, before the exhale is even finished, the monitors going flat again. And then the work of bringing him back, 8 times, over 6 hours. Each time, the threshold crossed. Each time, whatever was on the other side of that threshold, approached and then receded. Dr. Rex Kennemar, Sellers' personal physician, arrived within the hour. He would say in private accounts shared with colleagues that by the 4th or 5th event, he had begun to feel something he had not experienced before in cardiac medicine. A helplessness that had nothing to do with the clinical management, which was proceeding as well as it could. Sellers was not responding the way most patients responded. He seemed to be oscillating, not fighting and not surrendering, simply moving back and forth across a line, as though he had not yet decided which side he preferred. By 6 in the morning, he had stabilized. By noon, he was sitting up in bed, asking for tea in a voice barely recognizable as his own, looking at the ceiling with an expression that no one in the room could properly interpret. He did not speak about what had happened for 12 years. Not to Kennemar, not to the producers or studio representatives who visited, not to colleagues, not to the journalists who asked about the health crisis, to whom he gave answers that were technically true and completely uninformative. Not once, in 12 years, did Peter Sellers tell anyone what he had experienced in that room during those 6 hours and those 8 intervals. But here is what he had seen. He had not seen nothing. He had not experienced the blankness that medical consensus typically describes, not the tunnel or the light that people expect from books about near-death experiences. What he experienced in those intervals was something so specific, so structured, so impossible to explain in ordinary language that he had decided by the time he was stable enough to think clearly that he would keep it entirely to himself. Not because he feared being disbelieved, though he did. Not because he feared ridicule, though that was true as well. But because what had happened in those intervals was the most private thing that had ever occurred to him. More private than anything he had ever done as an actor, or as a husband, or as a man. It had been Richard Henry Sellers alone. And for a man who had spent his whole life belonging to other people's versions of him, the idea of keeping one experience entirely to himself felt, for the first time, like something approaching the possession of an identity. During the first arrest, in the earliest minutes of that morning, he became aware of a voice. Not sound, precisely. Not the auditory experience of sound the way it exists in the ordinary world. Something more interior than that. More like the memory of a voice than the voice itself. Except more vivid than any memory he had ever had. More present, more real than real. And the voice was saying his name, not Peter, not Sellers, not any of the professional or character names or the versions of himself constructed across a lifetime. It was saying Richard, his real name, the name his mother had given him, and then almost never used. His mother was still alive in April 1964. She would not die until 1967. But in whatever space existed between the heartbeat that stopped and the one that was forced back, her voice was there, saying Richard, the way she had said it when he was very young, before the performances became the primary mode of their relationship, before the Saturday evenings and the music hall friends and the accumulated years of him becoming everything but the boy she had originally named. It happened again during the 3rd arrest, and the 5th, and the 7th, 3 or 4 of the 8 intervals, not all of them. During some there was only absence, a blankness with its own specific texture, which he found almost more disturbing than the presence of her voice, because the absence, those intervals of pure nothing, suggested that what he experienced during the others was not simply a function of the dying itself. It was selective, it was chosen. Something in the space between the heartbeats was showing him particular things. And what it chose, again and again across those 6 hours, was his name, his real name, said by his mother in the voice she had used before he had learned to be anyone else. What does it mean, he asked himself, lying in that hospital bed looking at the ceiling, that the thing I carried back from 8 clinical deaths was my own name? He did not have an answer in April of 1964. He spent the next 12 years trying to construct one. The press coverage of the April events was extensive, carefully managed and almost entirely misleading. A single serious heart attack. Expected full recovery. The truth. The 8 separate cardiac arrests, the hours of oscillating, the medical team's private conclusion that he had come closer to permanent death than anyone they had managed to bring back, none of that made it into the papers. In 1964, Hollywood reputation management was extremely efficient. Sellers was removed from Kiss Me Stupid and replaced by Ray Walston, which was humiliating in the specific way that only being replaced can be, but which he accepted with a composure that surprised everyone who knew him. Because something had changed in how he related to humiliation. Something had changed in how he related to almost everything. He was different, and the people around him could see it without being able to name it. Not shattered, not diminished. The brilliance was still there, as dangerous and exact as it had always been. But underneath the performances, something new had appeared. A quality of attention when he looked at ordinary things. A glass of water, a closed door, the particular angle of afternoon light on a pavement that was different from before, more deliberate, more tender, as though he was cataloging what it meant to be in a world he had, 8 times in one night, nearly left permanently. His closest collaborators on the films he made in the late 1960s described a version of Sellers who was, if anything, more committed to the work than before, but who had stopped treating it as a competition or a demonstration. The racing urgency that had driven him through the early career, the need to prove the depth of the transformation, the almost compulsive reinvention, had quieted. What replaced it was harder to name but unmistakable to anyone working beside him. He was present in the work. He was not trying to disappear. He was trying to arrive. His daughter Sarah noticed that he had developed a habit of touching door frames as he passed through them. Not dramatically, not a ritual he ever explained or acknowledged. A brief, light contact with the fingertips every time he passed from one room to another, as though registering the threshold, as though marking the crossing from one side to the other with a small private acknowledgement. She never asked what it meant. She was not sure she wanted to know. What you have seen so far is only part of the story, because in those 12 years, Sellers was not simply carrying a private experience. He was being worn down by it. Private truths become heavy when they are large enough to require the constant work of concealment. By the mid-1970s, the weight had become something that expressed itself in ways people around him could see but not identify. A restlessness, a quality of suppressed urgency, the sense that something in him was pressing against the walls he had built around it. In 1976, his physician told him in a routine examination that his heart showed the accumulated damage of 1964, that his cardiovascular system retained the memory of having been pushed very close to its limit, and that this required attention, care, and honesty about symptoms. He needed to stop treating warning signs as inconveniences. He drove home from that appointment and sat in his car for 40 minutes before going inside. He was thinking about door frames, about his daughter and the things she had noticed but never asked about Richard Henry Sellers. The name called across whatever existed between the heartbeats. And somewhere in those 40 minutes, he made a decision. Not a complete decision about when or to whom or in what form, but a decision that carrying it alone for another 12 years was no longer something he was willing to do. That the time available to say the true things was finite in a way that could no longer be treated as theoretical. He returned to his doctor's office 2 weeks later and confirmed the appointment he had been postponing for a year. He sat in the examination room and answered the questions honestly, including the ones he had been giving dishonest answers to for some time. The physician looked at him with the specific expression of a doctor who has just received information that confirms what he had suspected. He said the things a physician says in that situation. Sellers listened. He nodded. He drove home and sat in his car again, but this time only for 15 minutes. He accepted an invitation to appear on The Tonight Show. Nobody had told the producers what he was actually planning to do when he got there. October 1976. NBC Studios, Burbank. Peter Sellers arrived at 4:45, early enough that the makeup artist and stage manager both noticed. He sat in the green room with coffee he did not drink, turning nothing visible over in his hands but with a quality of private absorption that anyone paying attention would have recognized as a man rehearsing something interior. He was 51 years old. His dark hair had gone substantially gray at the temples. He wore a dark charcoal blazer over a light blue dress shirt with the collar open. He looked to everyone who saw him that afternoon like a man who had arrived at some reasonable accommodation with himself. He did not look like a man about to say the most private thing he had ever said in any room. The pre-interview with the segment producer went smoothly. The Pink Panther, possible future projects, standard territory. The producer left satisfied that the segment was well mapped. Johnny Carson had no idea what was coming. He was in his dressing room reviewing note cards with the focused calm that was his professional preparation. He knew only that Peter Sellers was one of that evening's guests, and that the segment would be about the films. What Carson did not know was that he was about to ask the one question in 12 years that would open the door. Not because of research or preparation or any particular insight into what Sellers was carrying, because Johnny Carson had a gift that had nothing to do with technique. He could see when something was underneath a performance. He could sense the weight of what was not being said. And when he looked at Peter Sellers 11 minutes into their conversation, he saw something in the man's stillness that was not the ordinary stillness of a composed performer. It was deeper, more freighted. The stillness of a man sitting very close to something and using careful energy to remain at the precise distance he had calculated was safe. Carson leaned forward. He looked at Sellers for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "Peter, I want to ask you something different." Sellers looked at him, said nothing. "You've talked in interviews over the years about not knowing who you are when the camera's off, that there's no real Peter Sellers, just the parts. A pause. I think there's a question behind that nobody's asked you. When you almost died in 1964, in all the years since, he looked at Sellers steadily. What do you see? The studio went completely still. Peter Sellers sat with that question for 14 seconds. The show's clock confirmed it afterward. 14 seconds of silence on a taped national television program. Cameras running, 300 people in the studio, nobody speaking. The director in the control room later said he could not bring himself to call for the cutaway. Something in Sellers' face made the cutaway feel like an act of violence he was not prepared to commit. When Sellers spoke, his voice was different from the interview voice, quieter, more careful about its weight. I see my mother, he said. The audience waited for the turn. They knew Sellers. They knew his way of walking toward gravity through the side door of comedy. They waited for the absurdity. It did not come. During the first arrest, Sellers said, still looking at his hands, I became aware of a voice. Not the way you hear a voice in a room. Something more interior, more certain than sound. He paused. She said my name, not Peter, Richard. He looked up. She hadn't called me Richard in 30 years. Johnny Carson did not move. His hands were flat on the desk. His expression had lost the professional openness that was his standard interview posture and become something much simpler. He was just listening. She was alive in 1964, Sellers said. She didn't die until 1967, but in whatever space existed between the heartbeat that stopped and the one they forced back, her voice was there, saying Richard. The way she said it when I was very young, before I had learned to be anyone else. The studio was completely silent. It happened during several of the arrests, he continued. 3 or 4 of the 8, not all. During some there was only absence, which had its own quality. I found almost more disturbing, because the absence suggested that what I experienced in the others was not simply a function of the dying. It was specific. Something in those intervals was choosing what to show me, and what it chose, each time, was my name, said in the voice she used before the performances accumulated into something that looked, from the outside, like a person. Ain't few. Wait. Do not move past this without understanding what he was saying, because Peter Sellers was not describing a comforting vision of the afterlife. He was describing the precise moment in which the most carefully constructed vacancy in the history of English cinema had been interrupted by the sound of someone who knew what was actually inside it. Someone who had the name and used it, who reached into all the characters and all the performances and all the accumulated brilliant emptiness and said the one word that none of the characters could answer to. I have spent 12 years, Sellers said, trying to understand what she was telling me. His voice had gone further in, further away from any register he used professionally. The interpretation I keep returning to is this. She was not calling me back. Not exactly. She was telling me there was something to call back to. That Richard Henry Sellers, the person buried under 30 years of other people's identities, was still in there. Was still, whatever else was true about me, worth the return trip. Carson's jaw was set in the specific way that meant he was holding something back by force. A long moment passed before he spoke. Did you believe it? Sellers turned the question over with the seriousness of a man handling something that has required serious handling for a long time. I believed, he said finally, that I did not want to die as Peter Sellers. That was what the experience gave me, ultimately, whatever its nature, whatever the explanation. I came back 8 times from that room. Each time I came back as Richard, and each time I had to decide whether to bury him again or give him a little more room. A brief, real smile. The smallest, most unperformed smile anyone in that studio had ever seen on a face they had watched be 100 people. I have not been entirely successful, but I have been trying. That is the difference between before that night and after it. I have been trying, and my mother's voice, real or imagined, is the reason. Nobody in the studio moved. Johnny Carson sat back in his chair, and for a brief moment, he was not the host of anything. He was just a man who had been given something true by another man, and did not yet know what to do with it. Thank you, Carson said. His voice was careful with the weight. I think you just said the bravest thing I've heard on this stage in 15 years. The applause that came was not the reflexive applause of a studio audience responding on cue. It built slowly from the back of the room, the way certain sounds build when the people making them have not quite decided to make them yet. It was the sound of 300 people who had been holding something and found, unexpectedly, a reason to put it down. If you are still watching, and this story is landing somewhere in you, please take a second to hit the like button before you go. It costs nothing, and it genuinely helps this reach the people who need it. And if you want to go deeper with these stories, join the channel. Members get exclusive content and extended cuts that never reach the main feed. The link is in the description. 30 seconds. It directly makes these stories possible. The segment ran 19 minutes over its allotted time. Nobody cut to commercial. Fred de Cordova, the show's producer, stood in the wings for the full 19 minutes without writing anything on his clipboard. When the segment ended, he walked to his office, closed the door, and did not come out for 25 minutes. His eyes, when he emerged, told anyone who looked carefully enough. The switchboard at NBC was overwhelmed before the East Coast broadcast had finished airing. Not calls about the films or the career. Calls about the thing he had said. About a real name kept underneath the performance. About being called back by the version of yourself that existed before you learned to be anyone else. Hospitals reported increases in patients requesting conversations with counselors. Not about death specifically, but about the gap between the self performed for the world and the self known only to the people who had seen you at the beginning. Peter Sellers did not become close with Johnny Carson after that night. Their lives did not intersect frequently, but the people present for the conversation that happened off camera, after the lights dimmed and the audience filed out, described something more durable than friendship. Two men at an empty desk in an empty studio, talking. Not about the segment, not about how it would play, just talking. The way you talk to someone when you have given them something true about yourself and they have held it without dropping it. Carson walked Sellers to his car when it was time to go. The lot was empty and cool in the way October nights in Burbank can be, the sky clear, the studio building standing dark and still around them. They had been talking off camera and without audience for nearly an hour. Not about the broadcast, not about what it would mean in the press or how it would be received or what any of it implied for the career. Just talking. The way two people talk when one of them has recently said something true and the other has found, unexpectedly, that it landed in them somewhere they did not expect it to land. Before getting in, Sellers turned back. "The last thing," he said, "the thing I did not say in there." Carson waited. "After the ate the rest, when I came back that final time and understood I was going to stay." He paused. "She said something else, not just my name." His voice became the quietest it had been all evening. "She said, 'There you are.'" Carson stood on the empty lot for a long time after the car drove away. In 1979, Peter Sellers gave what many consider the finest performance of his career, Being There, directed by Hal Ashby, in which he played Chance the gardener, a profoundly simple man with no apparent history, no inner life, no past he could speak to, who was mistaken by the world for a person of great wisdom and depth, a vessel, a surface onto which every person projected whatever they needed to see. He told the film's writer, Jerzy Kosinski, that when he first read the screenplay, he had gone very still, not because the role frightened him, because it was so precisely, so uncomfortably accurate. Chance the gardener was not a character Sellers had to construct. Chance was the vacancy that Sellers had spent his career filling with other people's identities, given a name and a garden to tend. His performance was quieter than anything before, more transparent. For the first time in his career, the performance and the person were difficult to distinguish. The Academy nominated him. Critics reached for words like luminous and essential. What they were describing was a man being present rather than brilliant. And Sellers knew the difference, even if the audience could not always name it. By then he knew his heart was not going to hold indefinitely. His doctors had been clear. He had been listening, which was new. He had been calling his children more, touching the doorframes, giving Richard slightly more room than he had been given in the decades before. On the 22nd of July, 1980, Sellers collapsed in London. He was taken to Middlesex Hospital. On July the 24th, 1980, at the age of 54, Richard Henry Sellers died. Not 8 times this time, once, completely, and did not come back. The notices were enormous. Every major publication ran its proper account of the career, the gifts, the extraordinary facility for becoming other people. Almost none of them mentioned October 1976. Almost none of them mentioned the name. But Johnny Carson mentioned it. When Sellers died, Carson sat at his desk at the beginning of the show and spoke for 4 minutes without notes, about an empty parking lot at 1 in the morning, about a man getting into a car and saying something before he went, about needing to have told it so he would know it was real, so that when the next threshold came, he would know that the person who had been there and said those things existed. The same way his mother's voice had been real enough, in that April room in 1964, to call someone back who had not yet understood what he was being called back to. And there was one more thing, Carson said. The last thing Sellers had said to him in that parking lot. "She said something besides my name. She said, "There you are." Carson looked at the camera. "Peter," he said, "wherever you are right now." "I hope," she said, "your name again." The studio was quiet. And then, slowly, the applause. This is the story of a man who believed he did not exist and died 8 times before he understood what he was being told to come back to. A man who built a career out of becoming everyone else because the work of becoming himself was the hardest thing anyone had ever asked of him. A man who sat in a chair in 1976 and said the most private thing he had ever said in public, not because the moment was perfect, but because he understood that the alternative was another 12 years of carrying something alone, and that his heart, in the specific and non-metaphorical sense, was not going to offer him another 12 years. Think of the name you were given before you learned to perform yourself for the world. Think of the person who still calls you by it, if they are still here, and if they are not, think of the last time you heard it, and whether you knew then what you know now about what it meant. You do not have to die 8 times to find out what you are worth coming back to. But you do have to listen. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Tell me your real name if you want to. The one that stays.